Welcome into the horse race. I'm your host, Daniel Vaughn. We're here to cover everything related to the 2024 election, whether it's related to polling, the latest news, and tonight we're going to cover some economic stuff that could impact, if not this election, it could impact politics in the United States moving forward. So we've got a jam-packed show tonight. We're going to cover a lot of ground, everything from theories, from what certain pollsters have, to actual things that are happening across the states. So what we're going to cover tonight, and I mentioned, some theories here, is, and I've got it in the title tonight, is the divergence that we're seeing in the polls. And that's coming from very specifically some theories of the case. Some pollsters, and we're going to cover the New York Times specifically tonight, have a theory on how this election is going to go. Well, that's fine. Pollsters have all of those sorts of things every election cycle. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how that's impacting polling results that they're having, how their national results and their state results are in conflict with each other, at least from what we would know from any previous cycle, and how the New York Times, and specifically, is trying to, figure out how these two things come together. So that's going to be the main thing. We'll cover an overview, sort of a broad overview, what's happening, globally with polling across the board on the national level, and then we're going to wrap up going through some battleground states, and then finally, I'm going to cover a very specific chart that I came across this week on Twitter, now known as X, but a chart that sort of signals maybe some potential headwinds in the economy and how we need to sort of keep an eye on that, because I know the Federal Reserve is keeping an eye on that and why that's going to matter moving forward. So that's sort of a broad overview of what we're going to go through tonight. We're going to start out, though, with the New York Times. Now, the New York Times published a piece in it by Nate Cohn, who's the chief elections guy, chief data guy over there. And he talks about how Republicans' electoral college edge, once seen as ironclad, looks to be fading. The 30,000-foot view here essentially is this. It's that Donald Trump is performing better on a national level, but he is potentially underperforming in battleground states. And so previously, in 2016 and 2020, you knew Donald Trump was going to lose the national popular vote. That was something that was going to happen. You just also knew that he had strength in battleground states, specifically places like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and so on, and that those states leaned a little bit more to the right than national polls would show, just nationally. So what the New York Times is talking about now is that they're seeing sort of a reverse. Donald Trump is performing better on a national polling level basis, but he may be underperforming in the battleground states. So Nate Cohn goes to this piece, talks about what the difference would be if this is true. What I want to cover for you here, though, is the assumptions being made by this and why I would not make the same assumptions that they are making in their polling analysis. So he lays it out here. He says, on the one hand, Ms. Harris is holding her own in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And then on the other hand, you have Mr. Trump gaining in non-competitive states like New York. So if you go back to 2022, one of the surprise results was that Republicans overperformed in places like New York. And what people are pointing to now, potentially, is that Donald Trump is picking up national polling points in places like New York and California, and that helps him in the national polls, but he's not necessarily maybe holding up in the battleground states. If this is true, it would be the first time for Donald Trump and Republicans in general in decades where you would see a Republican overperforming on the national level, but underperforming in critical battleground states. And the caveat that Nate Cohn makes it here in his piece, but is important to, again, underline, this is a tenuous position, he says. He says, together, these states, meaning Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, help Kamala Harris win the Electoral College with little room for error. Should the polls meaningfully underestimate Mr. Trump in any one of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, as they did in the last two presidential elections, much of his Electoral College advantage could return. Meaning, this entire theory that Donald Trump is underperforming in battleground states depends solely on state polls of these areas and them being accurate. Because if you look at the national polls, you're going to see a very singular thing. Donald Trump is staying pretty close to Kamala Harris. We can bounce over here to the actual national polls and see this. So right now, Kamala Harris holds a 2.1 lead in the national polling average. What I want to point out to you here is that if you look down here at the New York Times Siena poll, they have the race as a tie. If you go back in time and look at some of the previous New York Times Siena polls, you will note here they've also had Trump with an outright lead on the national level. And this was leading into the debate with Kamala Harris. After the debate with Kamala Harris, you've got it back to a tie race for them. The New York Times is considered an A-plus pollster when compared to most. And so the fact that at a national level, and they've got nearly 2,500 voters here, and it's a likely voter screen, so we're not dealing with any of the other garbage, with some of these others who are still running registered voter screens. These types of polls are flat out red flags for Kamala Harris because it signals that she may not be as in a strong a position as some of her polling has suggested. And you don't have, you have another pollster here, Quinnipiac, who, had you asked me, a day ago, who was the most inaccurate pollster in the game, I would have said Q polls here because I don't consider them very accurate. And they are doing a similar thing to the New York Times. You're seeing right now they're showing the race nationally is tied, but if you look at their state level results, you're seeing Harris with a lead. So this theory that Trump is overperforming on a national level, but underperforming on a battleground state polls is impacting how some of these pollsters work. Now, if you look at somebody like Morning Consult here, or we've got Ipsos here with Reuters, they're very basic. They think that Harris is leading strongly. Ipsos here with a 6-point lead. Morning Consult has her with 5-point lead. If you look at their state level polling, they're going to show Kamala Harris with a lead across the board in all those. So these are just, they have a Democratic lean to them. It's very clear. I have some disagreements specifically with Ipsos. I think they have inaccurate polling. Part of the reason is if you look at the Ipsos polling here, they show Donald Trump with a 44% lead. In both 2016 and 2020, Donald Trump got over 46% of the national popular vote. And so I know for a fact, and in 2020, Donald Trump hit 46.9%. And it seems very likely right now he's sitting a little over 47%. If your poll shows him underneath that level of his, what seems like now his floor is 47%. And if you're saying, well, no, he's actually at 44%, I know your poll is going to be inaccurate because in 2016 and 2020, he was 2 points above that. So they have a margin of error here of 4 points. And I would just almost automatically add 3 points to Trump's total here and say this is actually half that lead. I don't normally, I'm not going to jump down into the crosstabs and figure out where that is. I just know that if you're showing Trump at 44%, like you see here with Reuters Ipsos or NBC News here, where they have it at a 44%, that's something that is interesting, but you can largely toss out. And even with Morning Consult, they have it at 45%. That's a little bit closer, but still, my baseline is I believe Trump's going to hit 47% if you measure all the votes together, and they're 2 points off of that. And so these types of numbers, 45 and 44, are questionable. Anything else, you have 47s, 48s here. All of that's fine. Even the 49s, I don't think Trump's necessarily going to hit 49 or 50%. But what you're seeing in a poll like this is you're pushing those leaners and you're trying to get, okay, if we pushed everyone off the ballot and it's just these two people, who are you leaning to and who are you voting for? Because those leaners are the ones who are usually in the more undecided camp. And so when you push them, you can usually find out where those voters are going to go come election day. So there are very strong polls for Harris here that I would say are generally weak. There are other polls here. I mean, Atlas Intel, I know they were the most accurate pollster. It would surprise me if Donald Trump went above 50%. And so this sort of swings in the opposite direction. Generally, right now, I think the race is correct where it is in the averages, which is you've got 49 to 47. That's a 2.1 lead for Harris right now. And you just average it all together. That's probably where things are. Notably, this is the same number, and I wrote a column about this week. This is the same number that Hillary Clinton had on Election Day 2016. So if you are Kamala Harris and you're looking at your numbers and you're saying, oh, yeah, this is, we're doing about as well as Hillary Clinton, that should be a red flag because it means you're seriously underperforming. Whereas Joe Biden was able to win by around 4 points, and that largely explains his lead. Now, I'm going to get back to the New York Times here because, when they're showing this race right here tied at 47-47, And again, this is a number for Trump, totally believable. This is number over here for Harris. That's a red flag. If she's only clearing that amount, that should scare Democrats, frankly, because it means that you're just barely treading water here. And a tie race nationally in any previous election, especially particularly specifically a national election like this, if it was tied at this level, Republicans are going to win because it meant they were stronger in a lot of these battleground states. But how this is changing is in swing state polling. So this is the polling we have right now for Pennsylvania. You'll note here the polling that the New York Times has here and Quinnipiac, both of which would show a tied race nationally. They have Harris leading in Pennsylvania and leading strongly by 4 and 5 points, respectively. Whereas everybody else has this basically a tie race. Every poll that I've seen come in over the last few days, it's the same story: tie race, tie race, tie race. Maybe you get a Trump lead here, but basically it's a tied race. But the two here who say that Trump's he is his lead in these states is overestimated are saying that Democrats have a strong lead here by 4 and 5 points, respectively. This is concerning because it shows that their models of how this election is going to go is skewing how they're coming to their conclusions. Because normally, if you had a tied race nationally, you would be looking at a 2 to 3 point lead here by Trump in any previous election. A tie race nationally means Donald Trump is winning. That's just what that means. If you went back with Biden on the ticket when a pollster had the two of them tied, they likely had Trump with a strong margin lead here as well. So this is a very specific um, theory that's being worked out here by these pollsters. And what Nate Cohn and the New York Times are trying to do is explain why this is happening in their polls, how this is theoretically possible, and whether or not that's even accurate. Now, when it comes to these polling averages, particularly specifically with Wisconsin, I trust the Real Clear Politics average of these states, very specifically with Pennsylvania, more than I do individual polls. So right now, if you average all of these together, you would have Harris with a zero point 0.6 lead. In 2020, the Real Clear Politics average had Biden at a 1.2 advantage, and that's what he got. Now, to get there, you have all these polls going backwards and forwards. You have a Biden +5 right next to a Trump +2. You have insider advantage here with Trump +2. So you've got these all over the place, and none of them were accurate. This +5 was off by around 4 points. These +2s were off by around three. So it's 3 or 4 points. So these were wildly inaccurate and all over the place, and it averaged out to 1.2, and that's what Biden got. Right now, you're looking at Harris 0.6, and I would believe that. That's probably about where we're sitting right now. And in this one, you've got them close. You've got a 47.7 versus a 48.3. So this is a neck and neck race. And Pennsylvania polling has been a little bit more accurate than some of these others. I don't believe that was the case in 2016. So yeah, in 2016, they were a little bit more off, but it still wasn't as far as what we've seen in some of the other states. So in 2016, it finished Clinton 0.19, and the reality was Trump won by a hair. The closest right here was actually this Trafalgar poll, which had Trump leading by one, but the rest of these were off by quite a bit. You're talking about Morning Consult being off by almost 5 points. This Harper poll here was a Republican pollster. They had it tied, and if you had it under a point lead, you'd be saying it's tied too. So there was some pretty inaccurate polling in 2016, whereas the averages kind of were able to figure it out in 2020. So that's one part of it. The first part of this is that if you're going to run this theory, you need your state polling to be accurate. In 2016, it had issues. In 2020, the averages got you there. But if you're looking here at 2024 and you're trying to make this argument, the state polling averages are saying this is just a you know 0.6 is barely a lead at all. That can be changed. That's well within the margin of error, and you would not call that a lead if you're a candidate. But they're saying this is a 4 and 5 point lead by Harris. So if they're saying this and everybody else is saying a tie, that suggests that their theory of the case is impacting how they're viewing things. Now they could be right. I'm not saying that they're wrong, but it is a distinction that needs to be made here. They are saying that Harris is stronger in the battleground states, and the other polling says that she's weak. So you've kind of got to figure out, it's sort of a choose your own adventure here. Which theme of this do you think is more accurate? For me, I always take these polls, I just toss them in this average and just go with what that says because it's going to get you closer to reality in the end. Anyway, if all the pollsters are wrong, you're getting an average of where how off they were on an average basis, and that's going to do it there. There's been a lot of political science studies over the years, and generally speaking, just go with the Real Clear Politics average or something like it, and it's going to get you closer to reality. Now, where I'm convinced that the New York Times, Nate Cohn, and the rest are wrong on this is when they point to Wisconsin. In this cycle right now, I can tell you right now, I know the polling is wrong on Wisconsin. And the reason I know this is because the polling is always wrong on Wisconsin. So let's jump over to this. In 2020, so last cycle, they were all over the place. They had some of these, like Ipsos and the New York Times, they had Biden up by double digits in Wisconsin. The actual spread in Wisconsin was Biden 0.7. They were off by 10 points or more. And that was not just them, that was pretty much everyone across the board. You have 8 here, you have another 8 here by Emerson. CNN had Biden up by 8. And they weren't alone here. You can go and jump to 2016, and it's the same story here. They had the final polling average there wasn't a lot of polling in Wisconsin because they thought she was going to win, but the polling we did have showed her leading by around 6.5 points here, and Trump won by 0.7. So you're talking, being off by around 7 points here. And even the Republican pollster here was off by almost 9 points. They had Clinton up by 8. Wisconsin is hard to poll, extremely hard to poll, and it's been true every cycle. And when you look at you're comparing some of these national polls here, and you're looking at the swing states. Right now, they got it at a .7 lead. So when you're talking about, but then you go back and you're looking at some of these others, you're like, well, where is it? Even Quinnipiac has it as a +1. Well, if you're looking at any past election and you're a Democrat, you're only leading by 1, and in the past you were leading by sometimes double digits, and you average this all out, and it's like, well, this is kind of scary here because if they were off by anywhere near the margins that they were in the past, which was as much as 6 points, that's a serious red flag because as a Democrat, you want a strong lead here because you have to build in that buffer for how large these margins are going to get for you. So Wisconsin and the theory that it's going to be accurate or inaccurate here is something I would just frankly chuck. Um, just chuck these polls because they were off by a lot in 2020. They were off in 2016, and you have to make in order to make the call that Donald Trump is underperforming in the battleground states. You had a better case for that in 2016 and 2020, and you got absolutely blasted because the margins that Biden was leading and Clinton were leading in this was larger in some cases than their national polling lead. So, if you're relying on very specifically, if you're relying on Wisconsin polling to be accurate, I don't know what to tell you because that is a fool's errand in my book. If you're wanting to do that with Pennsylvania, you could do that, but you're also looking at a .6 lead. A .6 lead by Harris does not indicate that she is in a strong position in these states. It means it's a very close race because Biden was up by, double this. He had a 1.2 lead in the final polling average. So if what we're seeing here is more of her momentum post debate, this is not where you want to be if you're Harris because you're in a much weaker position than you were in 2020 or 2016 if you're Democrats. These are not numbers that you want to see. They may be more accurate, but it's not something that you want to see because if Donald Trump overperforms here, you're looking not at a slight shift for him. You're looking at maybe possibly a 2-point advantage in some of these places or more. So the other one here that it's also a battleground state is North Carolina. You see some inaccuracies here. Everyone kind of thought Trump was going to win in North Carolina. I think he's going to win in North Carolina in 24. But here, you had over a point difference that showed Trump leading by 0.2. Final was 1.3. You have inaccuracies here. So just across the board, you look at some of these battleground polling. Michigan's another. Biden was, in 2020, Biden had a strong lead here. You can go to Arizona. Final one had Biden by about 1 point. The final was 0.3. So this is just my point in a nutshell. It's if you're depending on battleground states to say that Harris is overperforming, you're relying on the more inaccurate metric. The easier thing to do is to simply look at your national polling across the board, figure out where that is, and then look back at some of these battleground states and adjust accordingly. Right now, if you're if you're one of these, if you're New York Times or you're Quinnipiac, you're saying it's a tie race. If it's a tie race, Donald Trump is winning in these battleground states. That's just the name of the game. If you've been a Democrat and you've been in national politics for the last 8 to 10 years, you know if you're trying to win a national election, you need at minimum a 2.1, a 2.5 ish advantage in the national popular vote. You have a shot in these battleground states. That's just sort of the rule. Biden was able to hit 4.1, which gave him the victory. Clinton hit 2.1. Actually, Biden was at 4.5. Clinton is at 2.1. So you basically cut that in half, a little bit more than that. Biden had enough to get over the hump. Clinton did not. And as I've written in my columns, a lot of this is with white working class voters who are harder to get a hold of. And I've had shows on this in the past where we talk about some of these things, and what I really think is happening with some of these pollsters, both in battleground states and some of these national polls, particularly the ones that have a strong Harris lead, like Morning Consult, is that they're oversampling, very specifically white suburban voters and white collar working class voters who live in the suburbs. And those are going to be your white voters who are also college educated. They are sitting at home because they're more likely to be remote workers. And those are your people who are more likely to pick up a phone and answer a political poll. If you're actual working class, blue collar working class of any race, you're not going to be home and you're not going to be picking up a landline because those are the ones that are most important in theory in these polls. You're not picking up a landline to be captured in any of these polls. If you are a remote worker, you are, and those are more likely going to be your college educated white voters in a lot of these key areas. And it's just more likely than not they're being oversampled, which is why you can get something like this, like Donald Trump only hitting 44%. Whereas if you are a little bit more careful and try to do a high quality poll, which I know the New York Times is doing on a national level, you're going to hit this 47% here. It's just, I think the New York Times, Siena College here, I think their theory may run upon the rocks of the fact that their battleground polling has been wrong consistently in the past, specifically in Wisconsin, and you would just expect a polling error in those states just because that's the name of the game. So we covered Wisconsin, we covered all of that. One thing I also wanted to cover here is a chart from Tom Bevan that he put up from Gallup. It's a very interesting thing. So Gallup asks U.S. adults what their party identification is and how they're leaning one way or the other in a presidential election years. This is going to be sort of a helpful way to tell you where the country is leaning one way or the other. And for basically the last 40 years and beyond, most Americans have identified as Democratic. In 2004, you have the first time where the parties were tied. The collapse in 2008 caused Republicans to just dive down here. But for the first time in a very long time, Republicans now have the edge. There are now more people identifying as Republican in the Gallup survey as than there are Democrats. You can read this sort of similar to a sort of a generic ballot question. Who are you more likely to vote for in the election, the Republican or the Democrat? You remove names and just kind of asking people who they support. Republicans have never had an edge here. You can get an edge as a Republican in the generic ballot, but you have never had a lead here. So this is another red flag for Democrats. It's one of those things where if you have more people identifying as Republican, it means that Donald Trump's going to have a larger pool to pull from come 2020, and Democrats have a shrinking share, or the Democratic brand is damaged, and more Democrats are identifying as independent because they don't like some of the things that are happening. And you could see this in particularly with minority voters who a lot of them don't like the direction of the Democratic Party, and they are leaning towards Trump, but they're not going to say that. So they may just be removing party identifiers here, and that hurts the Democrats in the end. So this is something to watch here. Republicans have a lead, 48-45. How that factors in the end will be interesting. I've seen some people do like back of the envelope or napkin, cocktail napkin math that suggests that this could mean that Republicans have an outright win in the popular vote come election day. Again, if that is true, I would expect Trump to sweep the battleground states just because that is sort of the Occam's razor solution to that. If you have a lead there, you're more likely going to be sweeping the battleground states. Democrats are more cloistered in places like California and New York and have been for generations, and that shrinks their advantage in places like the battleground states. Um, the other thing that I think, and I've written about this too, that I think may impact how people view this and how these battlegrounds work too, is that we've had a big migration, specifically from COVID to now. People have moved out of the lockdown states, and that was almost perfectly split on a partisan level. If you were in a Republican state, you're more likely to be in a place that was open and with fewer lockdowns. If you were in a place like California, New York, Illinois, and you didn't like those lockdown measures, a lot of those people started moving because they just couldn't live. They couldn't keep a business open, so on and so forth. And so if you had, even some of these battleground states opened up earlier than the blue states. And so the migration effort has not been into blue states, it's been out of them. So to then flip this, as Nate Cohn and others are saying, and saying that, oh, well, Donald Trump suddenly has an advantage because he has more voters in these states, does not really match what we know is happening migration wise within these states. And so we know people are moving out of them. And in fact, at the end of this decade, some estimates already say that California, New York, and some others are going to lose electoral votes, and it's going to go to places like Tennessee, Texas, Florida, and so on. Um, you wouldn't then expect the reverse of that to be true on the poll. You wouldn't expect people to then say, okay, well, Donald Trump has more support in blue states. In reality, what we know is happening is that the partisan polarization lines in these states is hardening. And so if you're in a blue state, it's getting more blue. If you're in a Republican state, and it's getting a little bit more deeper red. So there's not really you're not really seeing states turn more purple. It's that they're hardening on partisan lines. So you see this, that is another red flag for Democrats. We'll see how that plays out as we get closer and closer to election day. Uh, but it is something to keep an eye on because it does signal that perhaps there is a larger pool of Republicans. If this actually just plays out overall, this is where you get the shocking scenario where the polling error goes to Trump again, and he walks away with both the Electoral College and the popular vote, which is not something anybody ever foresaw coming. All right. So that's all I've got on that portion. What I'm going to cover on this last section is the economy. This is a chart put up by Julia Coronado. She's an economics professor, and she's also been a chief economics expert at a lot of different firms. And she put out this chart that shows the measure of respondents saying that jobs are plentiful minus the percentage saying that jobs are hard to get. So basically, if you're a job seeker, if you say things, it's easy to get a job because I've got offers across the board. You take those and then you remove the people who say, no, it's hard, it's impossible to get a job. There are no options out there. Well, when you were at the peak of, you know, the inflation craze, there were a lot of jobs. And so no one was really having an issue getting a job because there were signs everywhere. Employers were just practically throwing money everywhere trying to get somebody to work in their business. So at the peak of the inflation craze, you had it there. What we've seen since then is a nosedive. You generally want this number going up because it indicates a strong labor market. It indicates that there's plenty of jobs to go around for everyone, and that it causes your wages to go up. But if it's going down, as we're seeing here, these gray areas indicate recessionary periods. So this is the dot-com 9/11 recession here, and then you have the great financial crisis here in the mid 2000s. And so that's when you see these things dive. This is, the dive that you have here wasn't real. This is during the pandemic, and then you see just the rapid rebound here, where things skyrocket back up. In reality, everybody changed jobs all over the place, and so it's just been a mixture. But typically, in the past, when you see this going down, that typically has indicated a recession, because it's just effectively saying it's just people saying it's harder and harder to find jobs. There's not as many positions opening, and places are not hiring. So this could be a scenario where the Federal Reserve gets its soft landing, and nothing comes of this, and we just have a smooth landing here, and this plateaus here, or it could crash and go negative, which could indicate that we're heading towards a recession here because it is financial conditions tightening. We're not going to know. Um, if you go into the comments of this post here, people are talking about how the Federal Reserve is likely behind in cutting rates because this signals that there could be more trouble to come. There have obviously been more layoff notices from some major companies. And so, whether or not that's holding or you're seeing sort of a smoothing out of the labor force remains to be seen. But these sorts of things are that the Federal Reserve is watching, and it's the sort of thing that generally, if you're watching across the country, this is something you keep an eye on too, because it signals that labor conditions are getting a little bit. If you're a job seeker, the market's getting harder. If you're an employer, things are great because you can offer lower wages more than likely and get a person for your job. At the peak of this, people were getting crazy offers and making all kinds of money jumping up. But now that is becoming harder and harder to get. So if this dips negative here or we keep falling, that could be a signal that the labor market is in trouble and the Federal Reserve is going to switch totally from focusing on inflation to trying to save the labor market. So keep an eye on these types of things here. We don't yet have anything in the unemployment claims data that would suggest that there's been a spike in people losing their jobs. This is just the number of people who are saying it's harder to find jobs. That's a slightly different connotation there. But we'll see. These sort of things play out over longer time horizons, and we'll see whether or not that's accurate. That's all I've got for you tonight. Make sure to tune in next week, and we'll cover the latest polls then and get you up to date on everything across the board. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe and like, and I'll talk to you guys later.